It was the third week of October, and Dave Mercer was standing at the edge of his driveway in suburban Columbus, Ohio, staring at something that made absolutely no sense to him. His neighbor's lawn, a modest quarter-acre lot on a street where every other yard had already gone brown and crispy, was still holding a deep, almost electric shade of green. Not the pale, yellowish green of a lawn that's barely hanging on, the kind of green you see on a broadcast from Augusta National on Masters Sunday, when the cameras pan across the fairways and every viewer at home thinks the color must be enhanced in post-production. It was that green. And Dave had been using the same four-step program from the same big box store for 11 consecutive years, spending north of $240 every single season, and by mid-September his lawn looked like a parking lot with ambitions. He walked over and knocked on his neighbor's door. The neighbor, a retired agronomist named Frank Pellegrini, who had spent 2 decades consulting for golf course operations across the Midwest, answered in a flannel shirt and took one look at Dave's expression before he started laughing. He said, "Dave, I stopped buying fertilizer bags 4 years ago. What you're looking at cost me less than $18 this fall." Dave thought he was joking. He wasn't. Here is the thing that the lawn care industry has spent the better part of 30 years hoping you never figure out. The most sophisticated turf management operations in the United States, the ones responsible for the fairways at Pebble Beach, the greens at Augusta, the playing surfaces that get inspected on national television by people who know exactly what healthy grass looks like. Those operations quietly abandoned the synthetic fertilizer model in the 1990s. Not publicly, not with a press release. They just stopped doing what they had been telling everyone else to do, because the research coming out of university agronomy departments and the United States Golf Association's own turfgrass research program was making one thing undeniable. You cannot grow world-class grass by poisoning the ground it grows in. And that is exactly what high-nitrogen synthetic fertilizer does. Not slowly, not subtly. It does it fast, and it does it completely. And then it forces you to buy another bag to compensate for what the last bag destroyed. The science behind this goes back further than most people realize. In the 1930s and 1940s, a soil scientist at the University of Missouri named Dr. William Albrecht was producing some of the most important agricultural research of the 20th century, and almost nobody outside of academic soil science circles has ever heard his name. Albrecht spent decades studying what he called the biological engine of productive soil. And what he found was that the fertility of any piece of ground had almost nothing to do with what you applied on top of it, and almost everything to do with the microbial community living inside it. A single teaspoon of genuinely healthy topsoil contains more living microorganisms than the entire human population of Earth. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, a staggering density of biological activity that functions as a nutrient delivery system, far more sophisticated than anything that comes in a plastic bag. These microbes break down organic material into plant-available nutrients. They build soil structure that holds water during dry spells. They produce natural antibiotics that suppress fungal diseases. They extend root systems by forming symbiotic relationships with grass plants that allow roots to reach moisture and minerals far deeper than they could on their own. Albrecht's central argument, supported by decades of field trials and soil analysis across dozens of states, was that when this microbial community is healthy, the plants growing in it are almost automatically healthy. And when you destroy it, which is precisely what high-salt synthetic fertilizer does when it contacts soil, the plants become entirely dependent on external inputs. You've turned living soil into a sterile growth medium, and now you have to supply everything artificially because the biological engine that used to do it for free is dead. His research was well regarded in academic circles throughout the 40s. And then the Second World War ended, and everything changed. The chemical plants that had been manufacturing synthetic nitrogen compounds for explosives during the war needed a peacetime market. Ammonium nitrate, the same compound used in bombs, turned out to be spectacularly effective at producing a rapid burst of green growth in grass and crops when applied in concentrated form. The companies that owned those plants were sitting on enormous production capacity, and they needed somewhere to sell it. Within a decade, the synthetic fertilizer industry had become one of the most powerful lobbying forces in American agriculture. University extension programs were being funded by chemical company grants, and the biological soil science that Albrecht had spent his career building was quietly pushed to the margins of mainstream agronomy. It didn't disappear. It survived in university research departments that didn't depend on chemical industry funding, in the work of scientists like Dr. Elaine Ingham at Oregon State, who spent the 1980s and 90s building what became known as the soil food web model, and in the practical experience of farmers and turf managers who noticed that their soils were getting worse every decade, despite applying more and more inputs. But for the average American homeowner standing in the lawn care aisle of a Home Depot in 2003, none of this existed. All that existed was a wall of blue and green bags with nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium ratios printed on the front and seasonal application schedules printed on the back. The golf course world started breaking from this model earlier than anyone else, and the reason was economic pressure combined with environmental regulation. By the late 1980s, golf courses in coastal states were facing serious scrutiny over fertilizer runoff contaminating groundwater and estuaries. The nitrogen leaching from heavily fertilized fairways was showing up in water quality tests downstream, and regulators were paying attention. At the same time, the cost of maintaining a championship quality golf course on a purely synthetic program had become astronomical. A top-tier course in the 1990s was spending $200,000 or more annually just on fertilizer and pesticide inputs, and the results were paradoxically getting worse. Disease pressure was increasing. Thatch was building up faster because the microbes that decompose it had been killed off. Root systems were getting shallower because synthetic nitrogen encourages top growth at the expense of root development. The superintendents managing these courses were caught in a textbook addiction cycle. Every application of synthetic fertilizer temporarily solved the problem it had caused, while making the underlying soil conditions slightly worse, which meant the next application needed to be slightly larger. The breaking point came from an unlikely direction. A group of superintendents working through the USGA Green Section Research Program began running side-by-side trials comparing conventional synthetic programs with what they were calling biological programs on their practice fairways and secondary rough areas. The biological programs used organic nitrogen sources, microbial inoculants, and carbon-based feeding amendments instead of synthetic salt fertilizers. The results, documented in USGA Green Section publications throughout the 1990s, were striking enough that they got passed around the superintendent community the way good intelligence gets shared, quietly, person to person, because the implications were uncomfortable for anyone who had been defending the conventional approach. Courses running biological programs were seeing measurably deeper root systems within a single growing season. Disease incidence was dropping without increasing fungicide applications. Thatch decomposition was accelerating. And perhaps most importantly for the bean counters watching the budget, input costs were falling by 30 to 50% in the second and third years of the program, as the soil began to function on its own biological engine rather than requiring constant chemical supplementation. This information did not make it into the consumer lawn care market. The companies selling $40 bags of synthetic fertilizer to homeowners had no interest in funding research that would eliminate the need for their product, and the extension programs that might have translated this research into public education were still largely aligned with the conventional input model. The gap between what the best golf course superintendents in the country were actually doing and what the average American homeowner was being told to do became enormous. And it stayed enormous for 30 years. What Frank Pellegrini understood, and what he explained to Dave Mercer over coffee that October afternoon, was that the system works because it operates on a completely different logic than the fertilizer bag model. You are not trying to feed the grass. You are trying to feed the organisms that live between the grass roots and the soil particles, because those organisms are the ones who actually deliver nutrients to the plant. Once you make that shift in thinking, everything else follows. The inputs change, The timing changes. The whole relationship you have with your lawn changes, because you stop treating it like a machine that needs fuel and start treating it like an ecosystem that needs conditions. The three ingredients at the center of this system cost a combined $40 to $50 for a full season of treatment on an average American home lawn. They are available at every feed store in the country, and two of them have been sitting on feed store shelves for over a century. None of them have a four-color marketing campaign. None of them sponsor television segments about lawn care. And every single one of them is doing something to your soil that no synthetic fertilizer has ever been designed to do. The first one is so cheap and so effective that when Frank pulled a bag of it out of his garage and handed it to Dave, Dave's first reaction was that it had to be wrong. It looked like compressed hay. It smelled like a barn, and it was about to become the most important thing Dave had ever put on his lawn. The bag Frank handed Dave that afternoon was 50 pounds of alfalfa meal, purchased from a livestock feed store 12 miles from his house for $22. The same bag that horse and rabbit owners buy by the pallet. Nothing fancy about the packaging, no lawn care branding, no promises about greening your turf in 14 days. Just a dense, fibrous, slightly sweet-smelling ground meal that looked entirely out of place in a suburban garage next to a red gas can and a push mower. Frank explained the science the same way he explained it to every homeowner who asked him why his lawn looked the way it did. Alfalfa is a legume, which means it fixes atmospheric nitrogen in its root nodules during its growth cycle. By the time it's harvested and milled into meal, it carries a natural, slow-release nitrogen content of roughly 3 to 5%, along with potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and a trace mineral profile that most synthetic fertilizers never even attempt to replicate. But none of that is why it works the way it does. The reason alfalfa meal produces results that consistently outperform synthetic nitrogen programs in multi-season trials is a compound called triacontanol. It's a naturally occurring plant growth regulator found in alfalfa's waxy surface coating, and research out of Michigan State University, beginning in the late 1970s and continuing through multiple subsequent studies, confirmed that triacontanol stimulates root cell division, accelerates photosynthetic activity, and, critically, dramatically increases microbial activity in the soil surrounding treated root zones. When you apply alfalfa meal to your lawn and water it in, you are not just fertilizing the grass. You are feeding a biological cascade that runs through the entire soil profile. The practical numbers are straightforward. You apply 20 pounds per 1,000 square feet of lawn area. You do this twice per year. Once in early spring after your first mow of the season, and once in early fall around the Labor Day window. The nitrogen release curve runs 6 to 8 weeks, which means you are feeding your soil steadily for almost 2 months from a single application. Compare that to a synthetic 30-pound bag of 20-10-10, which delivers a nitrogen spike in the first 2 weeks and then drops off completely, leaving nothing behind but slightly more acidic and slightly more microbially depleted soil than you started with. The alfalfa meal costs roughly 40 cents per 1,000 square feet per application. The synthetic bag costs between 60 cents and $1.20 for the same area, and it is actively degrading the thing you are trying to improve. Dave looked at Frank and asked the obvious question, why doesn't anyone sell this as a lawn product? Frank's answer was the kind of thing that sticks with you. Because there is no margin in selling something that works too well and too cheaply. And because the people who would need to change their buying habits are also the people being reached by a billion-dollar marketing industry that has every incentive to keep them buying seasonal bags on a calendar schedule. The system isn't broken, Frank said. It's working exactly as designed, just not for you. The second ingredient in Frank's program was liquid fish hydrolysate. And here, the distinction he made was one that almost every discussion of biological lawn care gets wrong. Fish hydrolysate is not the same thing as fish emulsion. Fish emulsion has been sold in garden centers for decades, and it works to a degree, but it is produced through a heat process that denatures the enzymes and destroys the amino acid chains that make fish-derived products genuinely valuable to soil biology. Hydrolysate is cold processed. The fish material is broken down enzymatically at low temperature, which preserves the full spectrum of amino acids, growth hormones, oils, and enzyme cofactors that make it one of the most complete biological soil amendments available. The mechanism matters because soil fungi, which are the organisms responsible for building the long-chain carbon structures that give healthy soil its sponge-like water retention capacity, feed specifically on the lipid and amino acid fractions that heat processing destroys. When you apply cold-processed fish hydrolysate to your lawn, you are feeding the fungal network that physically binds soil particles into aggregates, creates the pore structure that allows air and water to penetrate deeply, and forms the mycorrhizal connections with grass roots that extend the plant's effective root system by factors of 10 to 100 in terms of surface area contact with soil minerals. A gallon jug of quality fish hydrolysate runs approximately $28 to $32 and will treat a standard quarter-acre residential lawn 4 to 5 times through the season. The application is simple and requires no specialized equipment. 3 ounces of hydrolysate per gallon of water in a basic hose-end sprayer, applied at a coverage rate of 1 gallon of finished mix per 1,000 square feet. The smell, which is exactly what you would expect, dissipates within 24 hours as the material is absorbed into the soil surface. This is the element of the program that homeowners most frequently resist before they try it, and it is universally the element they stop noticing after the first application. The third ingredient is the one that surprises people most because they already own it: blackstrap molasses. The same product sold in the baking aisle and in bulk at feed stores, available by the gallon for approximately $12 to $15. The active component is carbon, specifically the complex carbohydrate chains that serve as direct food for heterotrophic soil bacteria, the organisms responsible for nutrient cycling, thatch decomposition, and the biological suppression of fungal pathogens that cause dollar spot, brown patch, and the other turf diseases that send homeowners to the pesticide shelf every summer. The mechanism was documented clearly in soil biology research conducted at Texas A&M and subsequently replicated at several other land-grant universities. When a readily available carbon source is introduced into biologically active soil, bacterial populations can double within 48 hours. That doubling event triggers a cascade of soil biological activity: increased enzyme production, accelerated organic matter decomposition, elevated levels of humic and fulvic acids that chelate soil minerals and make them plant available, and measurable increases in the soil's cation exchange capacity, which is the fundamental measure of how much nutrient the soil can hold and release on demand. Frank mixed the fish hydrolysate and the molasses together in the same sprayer, 3 ounces of each per gallon of water, and applied them simultaneously on a 3 to 4 week rotation through the growing season. The combined cost of a full season's treatment on a typical residential lawn came to less than $45. His lawn's growing season, measured from the date of green-up in spring to the date of dormancy in fall, was running 4 to 6 weeks longer than comparable lawns in his neighborhood. His water usage had dropped by over 60% compared to his synthetic program years, because biologically active soil retains moisture like a sponge, rather than shedding it like compacted clay. He had not applied a fungicide in 3 years. These are not anecdotal claims from a gardening forum. The biological mechanisms behind each of these outcomes are documented in peer-reviewed soil science literature and in USGA turfgrass research publications going back to the 1990s. What Frank had done was take the science that golf course superintendents were running on championship fairways and scale it down to a quarter-acre residential lot in Ohio. The inputs were different in quantity, but identical in principle. The results tracked almost exactly with what the commercial turf research showed. Dave Mercer stood in Frank's garage for another hour, looking at 3 containers of feed store products that together cost less than 1 bag of the synthetic fertilizer he'd been buying every season for over a decade, and tried to process the fact that the lawn care industry had essentially never pointed him toward any of this. He drove home, pulled up the USGA Green Section Research Archive online, and spent the better part of a weekend reading through publications that were technically public but had never been packaged into anything a homeowner could act on. Everything Frank had told him was in there, documented, replicated, peer-reviewed, and sitting in plain sight for 30 years. The next spring, he bought alfalfa meal, fish hydrolysate, and blackstrap molasses. He spent $43 total.
By mid-May, his lawn was the best he'd ever seen it. But there were still 4 critical mistakes he was making without knowing it. Habits that were quietly working against everything the biological program was trying to build. And understanding them would turn a good result into something that made the entire neighborhood stop and look. The morning Dave Mercer applied his first round of alfalfa meal, he made a mistake that roughly 80% of American homeowners make every single time they mow their lawn. He attached the collection bag to his mower. He mowed his lawn, filled 3 bags with clippings, dragged them to the curb, and felt the satisfaction of a clean-looking yard. He had just hauled away approximately 1 pound of free nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, along with potassium, phosphorus, and the partially decomposed organic material that his soil microbes could have converted into humus within a week.
He did this out of pure habit, because that is what his father did, and what the neighbor on his left did, and what the 3 lawn care guides he had read in the previous decade had all told him produced a cleaner, healthier-looking yard. None of that is true. The clipping removal habit is one of the most damaging things a homeowner can do to a biological lawn program. And it persists because it feels productive. The lawn looks tidier immediately after bagging. But what you are actually doing is removing the primary carbon and nitrogen input that your soil microbes depend on between your biological amendment applications. In a biologically active soil, which is what you are building with the alfalfa, fish hydrolysate, and molasses program, grass clippings decompose and disappear within 5 to 7 days. The surface looks clean within a week. The soil receives a continuous low-level feeding, and the thatch layer that accumulates on synthetic programs never develops because the microbial population processing the clippings is too active to let organic matter pile up undigested. The second mistake Dave was making, and the one with the most dramatic consequences during summer heat, was his watering pattern. Every morning at 6:30, his irrigation system ran for 12 minutes per zone. It felt thorough. The surface was always slightly damp. His roots were confined entirely to the top 2 inches of soil profile because that was as deep as the moisture ever reached, which meant that when air temperatures hit 94 degrees for a week in late July, his root zone dried out in 48 hours and the grass went into stress regardless of what biological program it was on.
Deep, infrequent watering. 1 inch per application, once or twice per week, with complete drying of the surface layer between applications, drives roots downward through the soil profile in search of moisture. Roots that reach 4 to 6 inches deep are accessing soil zones that maintain temperature and moisture stability through weeks of surface heat. That is where survival happens in a dry summer. The third mistake was one that Frank had warned him about explicitly, but that Dave had rationalized around because his back lawn had a persistent broadleaf weed problem. He had applied a granular weed and feed product to one section in April, telling himself it was a small area and it wouldn't matter. It mattered. Weed and feed products are broadleaf herbicides combined with synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, broadcast across the entire lawn surface to treat weeds that typically occupy 3 to 5% of the turf area. The other 95% of your soil takes the full chemical load. The herbicide fraction, typically dicamba or 2,4-D, is moderately toxic to soil bacteria and significantly toxic to the mycorrhizal fungi that form the biological bridge between your grass roots and the soil mineral supply. A single weed and feed application can suppress soil fungal populations for 6 to 8 weeks. Applied to a lawn you are simultaneously trying to build biologically, it is roughly equivalent to starting a fire in a building you are trying to renovate. The fourth mistake was the most expensive one, measured in money spent over the previous decade. It was the 4-step program, the seasonal fertilizer system sold in a single box by companies like Scott's and Pennington, designed to be applied on a fixed calendar schedule regardless of what the soil actually contains, what the weather has been doing, or whether the grass actually needs feeding. The calendar on the bag is not a scientific recommendation, it is a repurchase schedule.
The 4 applications are timed to create a dependency cycle in which each application of high-salt synthetic nitrogen slightly damages the soil's biological capacity, which makes the grass slightly more dependent on the next external application to maintain its appearance. The homeowner sees the logic as seasonal feeding. The agronomist sees it as a managed addiction. The company sees it as a recurring revenue model. Understanding these patterns changed Dave's entire approach, not just to the biological program, but to how he thought about his lawn as a system. A lawn is not a floor that needs periodic waxing. It is the surface expression of a soil ecosystem, and the appearance of the grass is a real-time readout of the condition of what's living underground.
When the grass looks bad, the instinct the fertilizer industry has trained into millions of homeowners is to apply something on top of the grass. The correct instinct, supported by decades of soil science research, is to ask what has changed underground and address the cause rather than masking the symptom. Dave pulled a basic soil test from the Ohio State University Extension Office, $15, results in 10 days, and found out that his soil pH was 5.8, his organic matter content was 1.4%, and his cation exchange capacity was so low that even if he applied the perfect biological program, his soil couldn't hold the nutrients long enough to deliver them to the root zone. He needed to raise his pH to between 6.2 and 7 with pelletized limestone, and he needed to build his organic matter above 3% before the biological system would perform at full capacity.
Those 2 things explained why his lawn had always struggled in August, even when he was spending $240 a year on synthetic inputs. He had been pouring money into soil that physically could not hold it. The limestone cost $11 for 40 pounds. He applied it once in fall and once the following spring. By the second spring, his soil test came back at 6.4 pH and 2.1% organic matter, still climbing. The biological program was building the soil while feeding the grass, compounding its own results season over season. And it was in that second spring that Frank Pellegrini walked across the yard during a Saturday morning and told Dave there was one more thing. One specific trick that golf course superintendents used in the 48 hours before a major televised tournament when they needed that color to look genuinely unreal on camera. There is a 1-pound bottle sitting on a shelf in most well-stocked garden centers that almost no homeowner ever picks up because it doesn't promise what the bags next to it promise. It doesn't claim to grow thicker grass or kill weeds or feed your lawn for 3 months. The label says chelated iron sulfate, and the application instructions are technical enough that most people put it back and reach for something with a simpler promise. That bottle costs approximately $11 to $13, depending on the brand, and it lasts 2 full growing seasons on an average residential lawn. Golf course superintendents have been using it for decades, and it is the direct answer to a question that millions of people ask every spring when they watch Masters coverage and wonder why professional fairways look a color that residential grass never quite achieves. Iron does not feed grass the way nitrogen does. It does not drive cell division or root growth. What it does, with remarkable precision and speed, is activate the chlorophyll molecule in existing grass blades. Chlorophyll is an iron-containing compound. The magnesium atom at its center is stabilized by an iron-dependent protein complex. And when soil iron is low or unavailable due to high pH, the chlorophyll concentration in grass blades drops and the green color fades toward yellow-green or pale lime. This is called iron chlorosis, and it is extremely common in lawns that have been maintained with high pH irrigation water or in soils where pH has drifted above 7. Applying chelated iron sulfate, chelated meaning the iron is bonded to an organic molecule that keeps it soluble in the soil solution rather than precipitating out as insoluble iron oxide, delivers bioavailable iron directly to the root zone where the grass can absorb it immediately. The color response is visible within 12 to 24 hours of application and represents one of the most dramatic single-product transformations you can produce in a lawn without any genetic modification or synthetic chemistry. The same turf that looked decent the day before looks like a major tournament broadcast the day after. The effect lasts 3 to 4 weeks per application. The mixing rate is 2 ounces per gallon of water, applied at 1 gallon per 1,000 square feet with a hose end sprayer. Critical warning. Chelated iron sulfate will permanently stain concrete, brick, and stone surfaces a rust color that does not respond to pressure washing or standard cleaning products. Keep the sprayer completely clear of driveways, walkways, edging, and any hardscape surface. Apply on a still day when there is no wind drift risk. Rinse the sprayer immediately after use. Frank used chelated iron sulfate on a 5 to 6 week rotation from May through September, always in the week following a biological amendment application, when soil microbial activity was highest and iron uptake was most efficient. The combination of the biological program building the soil's long-term mineral cycling capacity and the iron applications optimizing the surface color expression produced results that were, by Dave's second year on the full program, genuinely remarkable enough that 3 different neighbors knocked on his door during the summer to ask what service he was using. He told them the truth. Feed store alfalfa meal, cold processed fish hydrolysate, blackstrap molasses, chelated iron sulfate, a $15 soil test, no lawn care service, no synthetic fertilizer, no 4-step program. The total spend for his entire season was under $60, less than a quarter of what he had been spending annually for 11 years on a program that made his lawn worse every decade. By the end of his second biological season, Dave's soil organic matter was approaching 3%. His root depth, measured by pulling a core sample and examining the soil profile, had increased from roughly 2 inches to between 4 and 5 inches. His August lawn, historically the worst month, the month that had defeated him every year without exception, held its color through a 2-week stretch in which the temperature didn't drop below 88 and rainfall was less than 1/4 of an inch. He watered once that entire 2 weeks. His neighbors on synthetic programs watered every other day and still went dormant. The science that Frank Pellegrini had been applying to his lawn for 4 years, and that golf course superintendents had been running on championship fairways for 30 years, and that Dr. William Albrecht had documented in meticulous detail 70 years ago before it was buried under post-war chemical industry marketing. That science does not require expertise, equipment, or a significant financial investment. It requires a soil test, a feed store, a hose-end sprayer, and the willingness to spend one afternoon replacing a habit that has been costing you money every season, while making your soil worse. The green color you see on tournament broadcasts is not a different species of grass, or a different climate, or a different genetic stock. It is what grass looks like when the soil it is growing in is functioning the way soil is supposed to function, when the biological engine is running, when the roots are deep, when the mineral cycling is continuous, when the organism that evolved over millions of years to live in a thriving microbial community is finally getting what it actually needs. Your soil can do this. It is trying to do this right now, underneath whatever's left of this season. The organisms are waiting. The mineral profile is there. Everything that needs to happen can begin with a bag of feed store alfalfa and a hose. If this changed how you think about your lawn, drop a comment and tell us what zone you are growing in and what your biggest summer challenge has been. We read every single one. If you are going to try the biological program this coming season, hit the like button so we know to keep making content like this. And if you want to see the complete seasonal calendar, the soil test walkthrough, and the exact sprayer setup we use for the fish and molasses application, subscribe and turn on notifications, because that video is coming next. We will see you there.